Let's talk about the first woman ever created by the gods, specifically designed from the ground up to be humanity's punishment, who then got blamed for several thousand years for a decision that, if you actually examine the situation with anything resembling fairness, was essentially rigged against her from the moment she took her first breath. Her name was Pandora, and her story is the original gold standard example of an institution that survives to this very day in every workplace, every relationship, and every late-night decision your species makes while exhausted, hungry, or both. The institution of setting someone up to fail and then acting shocked, absolutely shocked, when they fail. Here's the actual setup, which most people conveniently skip when they use the phrase opening a Pandora's box to describe literally any minor inconvenience at the office. After Prometheus committed his previously discussed crime of generosity by handing humanity fire, Zeus decided that simply chaining one titan to a rock for eternal liver torture wasn't quite enough punishment for an entire species. He wanted something more comprehensive. Something that would punish humanity itself, collectively, indefinitely, for the audacity of having received a gift they didn't even ask for. So Zeus commissioned the gods to build a woman, not born, not grown, manufactured, piece by piece, the way you'd assemble a particularly elaborate piece of corporate sabotage. Hephaestus, the god of the forge, shaped her physical form out of clay. Athena breathed life into her and taught her skills. Aphrodite gave her an almost unbearable physical beauty, the kind designed specifically to disarm suspicion. Hermes gave her the gift of persuasive speech, along with, according to several ancient sources who clearly had opinions about women they were not shy about sharing, a healthy dose of cunning and the capacity for deception. Every single god contributed something, which is, incidentally, where her name actually comes from. Pandora, literally translated, means all gifted, or the one who has every gift. It sounds like a compliment. It was a weapon, assembled by committee, with every divine contributor adding precisely the trait needed to make the eventual catastrophe possible. Zeus then did something that should sound deeply, uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has ever worked a job with a manager who sets impossible expectations and then waits, almost gleefully, for you to fail them. He gave Pandora as a wedding gift to send her off to marry a mortal man named Epimetheus, a sealed jar. Not technically a box, in case you were wondering why I keep correcting a phrase your entire language has been using incorrectly for several centuries due to a mistranslation by a 16th century scholar who apparently thought jar sounded less poetic than box. A jar, sealed completely, containing something Zeus deliberately never explained. And along with this jar came one single, simple instruction. Do not open it. That's it. No further context, no explanation of consequences, no warning about contents. Just an order, delivered to a being specifically engineered by multiple gods to be curious, persuasive, and irresistibly drawn toward exactly the kind of forbidden knowledge that order implied existed inside. Let's pause here and run the numbers on this setup with the cold, dispassionate analysis it deserves. Because this is genuinely one of the most transparent entrapment schemes in the history of recorded mythology. And somehow, Pandora has been the punchline for it for 3,000 consecutive years. You take a being you yourself designed to be curious, persuasive, and irresistibly compelling. You hand her a sealed container specifically described as forbidden, with zero context about its contents or consequences. You tell her not to open it, and then you walk away, presumably to go watch from a comfortable vantage point on Olympus with the divine equivalent of popcorn. If you set a trap this obvious for a lab rat, ethics boards would shut your entire research facility down within the week. Zeus did it to an entire species, and somehow the species in question collectively decided, for 3 millennia, that the woman who eventually opened the jar was the villain of the story, rather than the architect who built an inevitability and then framed it as a choice. Predictably, inevitably, in the exact manner anyone with a basic understanding of human, or in this case, divinely engineered, psychology could have predicted, Pandora opened the jar. Some versions of the myth suggest she was simply overwhelmed by curiosity that had been deliberately, surgically installed in her by the gods themselves. Other versions suggest her husband Epimetheus, whose name literally translates to something like hindsight or afterthought, which tells you everything you need to know about his decision-making capabilities, was the one who actually convinced her to look inside. Either way, the lid came off and outpoured every conceivable misery that would plague the human species from that moment forward. Disease, poured out into the world like a toxic gas finally allowed to disperse after being compressed for too long. Famine, crawling out to ensure that no matter how much food humanity eventually managed to grow, some portion of the population would always be denied enough of it. War, slithering free to guarantee that even when individual humans figured out how to cooperate peacefully, larger groups of them would eventually find new and creative reasons to slaughter each other anyway. Old age, death, jealousy, despair, every single affliction that has ever made human existence genuinely difficult, all of it, simultaneously released into a world that, up until that exact moment, had apparently been blissfully free of all of it. Pandora, in a panic that any reasonable person would consider entirely justified given the literal embodiment of human suffering currently escaping into the atmosphere around her, slammed the lid back down as fast as she could. But it was too late, obviously, because that's how every single version of this exact story works, in every culture, in every century. The damage was already loose in the world, irreversible, permanent. The genie thoroughly and catastrophically out of the bottle. Except, and this is the detail that almost every retelling either skips entirely or rushes past so quickly you barely register it, one single thing remained trapped inside the jar when Pandora managed to seal it shut again. Hope. Somehow, in the chaos of every conceivable horror escaping simultaneously, hope alone stayed behind, trapped in the same container that had just unleashed disease, war, and death upon an entire species. Now, here's where ancient scholars have argued for literally thousands of years about what exactly this detail means, and I find their disagreement almost as entertaining as the original myth itself. One interpretation, the comforting one, the one your grandmother probably told you if she ever bothered explaining this myth, suggests that hope staying in the jar was actually a gift. Even after every conceivable misery was released into the world, humanity still had hope left over, safely contained, available whenever they needed it. A small mercy buried beneath an avalanche of catastrophe. This is a lovely interpretation. It is also, in my professional opinion, as someone who has observed your species with significantly less sentimentality than your grandmother, almost certainly the less interesting and possibly less accurate reading of the actual myth. Here's the considerably darker interpretation, the one that actually fits the rest of the story's brutal internal logic. If hope stayed trapped inside the jar along with everything else, sealed away the moment Pandora slammed the lid shut, then hope isn't something humanity has freely available to it. Hope is just as locked away, just as inaccessible, just as sealed inside that same cursed container as the disease and the despair were before they escaped. Under this reading, what actually got released into the world wasn't a mixed bag of catastrophe with a silver lining of hope tucked safely inside for emergencies. What got released was every hardship, completely unfiltered, while the one thing that might have made enduring those hardships bearable got left behind, trapped, sealed, theoretically present somewhere, but functionally unreachable to the species that needed it most. Sit with that version for a second, mortals, because it explains something about your own daily existence that the cheerful grandmother version conveniently glosses over. You live in a world absolutely saturated with disease, war, jealousy, and despair. Walking around freely, unrestrained, doing exactly what Zeus's jar released them to do 3,000 years ago. And hope, the thing that's supposed to balance all of that out, frequently feels exactly like it's trapped behind a sealed lid you can't quite pry open, no matter how hard you try. Accessible to other people, apparently. The ones who seem to have it figured out, but stubbornly out of reach whenever you personally need it most. At 2 in the morning, scrolling through old text messages from someone who clearly isn't coming back, looking for some scrap of reassurance that things will eventually improve. And this, mortals, is precisely why your species keeps opening jars it has no business opening, over and over, in every single generation, despite 3,000 years of cautionary mythology specifically designed to warn you against exactly this behavior. You check the phone of a partner you suspect is lying to you, knowing, with absolute certainty, that whatever you find will only make things worse. And you check anyway, because not knowing feels somehow more unbearable than the catastrophe of actually knowing. You read the comment section you swore you'd avoid. You Google the symptom you already suspect is something serious. At midnight, alone, when no rational decision has ever historically been made by anyone, at midnight, alone, Googling symptoms. Pandora's curse was never really about curiosity itself, mortals. It was about the specific, very human inability to leave well enough alone when the alternative, simply not knowing, feels worse than whatever horror might actually be waiting on the other side of that lid. The jar gets reopened every single day by every single one of you in 1,000 small forms you don't even recognize as the same ancient mistake. And somewhere, I have to imagine, Pandora is still waiting for someone, anyone, to admit that she was never really the one who set the trap.